In the long memory of Rome, few rulers cast a shadow as dark as Tiberius Caesar Augustus. He began as a disciplined commander, the sort of leader Romans trusted with borders and budgets. But the further he rose, the more something inside him seemed to warp. Later, generations would argue over the stories, some too awful to fully repeat, yet the convergence of ancient voices, especially from Suetonius and Tacitus, suggests that behind the marble and ceremony there lived a figure whose corruption bent the limits of imagination. When Tiberius took power in 14 AD, Rome exhaled. Here was a veteran general who had kept the northern frontiers safe and shown a talent for administration. As the adopted son of Augustus, he felt like continuity, a sober hand on the tiller after the founding emperor. He wore reserve like armor, stern, dutiful, even reluctant. But fissures had already formed beneath the surface. His private life was brutalized by fate and politics. The loss of his brother Drusus, the forced end of his marriage to Vipsania, the one person many believed he truly loved, and a calculated, loveless union with Julia Augustus's notoriously unfaithful daughter. These wounds didn't heal, they hardened, deepening into quiet resentments that would, in time, split wide open. His transformation wasn't immediate. For roughly a decade, Tiberius governed competently. He upheld Augustus's policies, kept a steady treasury, avoided reckless campaigns, and at least pretended to respect the Senate. He sent clear signals of continuity: restrained spending, cautious diplomacy, fair pay for the legions. But those who saw him up close noticed a different current. He had the habit of studying people too closely, as if measuring a threat. The guarded wit curdled into sly contempt. With each passing year, bitterness seeped in, and the fatigue of power, more than the exercise of it, began to define him. The turning point arrived with the death of his son Drusus in 23 AD. Rumors of poison spread like oil across water. Whether murder or mischance, grief cracked the mask. He grew harsher, suspicious, unwilling to risk proximity with anyone he couldn't fully control. The general who once drove legions through fog and forest began to retreat from the living world. He answered Rome's public theatre with silence, substituting presence with letters that condemned, consoled, or commanded, without his face ever appearing. In 26 AD, he staged the exit that would haunt his legacy. He abandoned the capital for Capri, a dramatic island near Naples whose cliffs seemed to plunge straight into an indigo sea. The official reason was rest, time to breathe away from the city's endless ceremony. In practice, Capri became a private dominion. He built across it a constellation of 12 villas, each a polished jewel of luxury, soundproofed by distance and guards. Their walls watched a horizon that promised privacy and carried secrets back only in whispers. From these heights, Tiberius ruled with ink and fear. The Senate continued to debate in Rome, dressed in tradition. The real decisions landed in courier pouches stamped with the emperor's seal. A word on parchment could end a life. A pause in correspondence could spark panic. Those invited to Capri often returned changed. Some came back with eyes that had seen what couldn't be said. Some didn't return at all. He grew reliant on astrologers, none more influential than Thrasyllus, a learned courtier who fed the emperor's anxious appetite for signs. He charted the heavens. Tiberius mapped enemies from those charts. The old Roman habit of wary politics became something else. Every senator a suspect, every gathering a potential plot. He found safety only in distance, sat with suspicions as if they were company, and let the machinery of the state tighten around imagined threats until they became, in effect, real. What set Tiberius apart wasn't simply cruelty. Rome had endured harsh rulers and bloody times before. It was the method, an inventive malice that turned pleasure into policy. Ancient writers relay scenes so unsettling that even they hesitate, and modern readers wonder where rumor ends and reality begins. Yet the repetition across sources chills. The focus on the vulnerable, the creation of systems to procure and train victims, and the normalization of abuse within the imperial household. Children, boys and girls, were lured to Capri under respectable pretexts: education, patronage, opportunity. The island's pools became theaters for grotesque games. Some were taught to swim around him, little fish, as later writers put it, in ways that turned innocence into choreography. The stories multiply. Staged performances where the young were ordered to enact acts for the emperor's gaze. A private library not of philosophy and history, but erotic instruction from across the empire curated as manuals rather than art. In this world appeared the spintria, children moulded into instruments of pleasure and trained in acts so specific the language paled. Taken from families or sold by desperation, they were educated in a single curriculum, the emperor's desires. They lived in the villas and moved across Capri like both servants and prisoners, without a future beyond utility. When they wore out or knew too much, silence often followed. Final, efficient silence. An economy of complicity grew around these appetites. Ambitious nobles offered what should have been unthinkable. Some advanced by supplying the young or arranging introductions. Others became brokers, scouring provinces for whatever the emperor preferred at the time. Human life turned into currency. If someone balked, accusations sprouted like weeds: treason, sacrilege, subversion. Property was seized, families broken. Participation became a shield. Refusal became a sentence. The stories that leaked from Capri carried escalating horror. Infants abused, sacred rites corrupted for gratification, victims thrown from cliffs when their use had ended, with soldiers posted below to ensure no one survived. Whether every detail is accurate matters less than what people believed, and they believed their emperor capable of these things. Fear breathed life into rumor, and rumor, under a regime like this, often traced the outline of truth. His cruelty spread beyond the private sphere. He liked to play with hope. Prisoners expecting execution might receive a reprieve, only to be killed later for greater effect. Parents were forced to witness a child's death, or made to continue performing public duties with a smile after a personal catastrophe. The line between governance and sadism vanished. Power became a stage for the spectacle of control. Treason trials evolved into a machine. The charge of maestas, in injury to the majesty of Rome, was elastic enough to catch a breath. A word, a gesture, a look could become evidence. Professional informers, delatores, grew rich packaging outrage as loyalty. Once accused, survival became improbable. Torture wasn't simply used, it was refined. The emperor's interest in novelty bled into punishments designed for maximum dread. Confession, under such methods, became meaningless. Its purpose wasn't truth, but submission. The Senate, once the conscience and brain of the Republic, shrank into a chorus of anxious praise. Senators competed at flattery. They voted away colleagues on whispers, scared that mercy would mark them as suspects. Some chose suicide to protect their estates for their families, a last act of control in a world where they had none. Even death offered no guarantee. The emperor resurrected old laws to prosecute the deceased, seize their property, and smear their memory. Children could be punished for mourning too openly. Coins bearing the imperial image became traps. Carry one into a latrine, and you risked insult to the majesty of Rome. Poetry became dangerous. Soothsaying became a capital gamble. The law no longer described justice, it described the emperor's mood. Under this pressure, Rome's social life dimmed. Dinner parties fell quiet, laughter measured, stories trimmed of anything pointed. Writers hid drafts, some burned them. Parents taught children the art of silence, even in sleep, as if words might betray them without their consent. The old Roman delight in debate and wit receded into a culture of calculated vagueness. Public life continued, but behind it lay a permanent wince. On Capri, his body deteriorated as his paranoia sharpened. Ancient accounts describe sores and lesions, harsh ointments, wigs to hide baldness, heavy cosmetics to cover the damage. He layered guards upon guards, tested food on the condemned, and kept the stars as anxious company through Thrasyllus and others who read the sky for threats he already believed in. Meanwhile, in Rome, the Praetorian prefect Sejanus became the central axis of administration, ambitious, efficient, and dangerous. For a time, Sejanus effectively governed in Tiberius's name, orchestrating purges, managing trials, and expanding his own network. But trust was a currency the emperor never spent willingly. In 31 AD, he turned on his prefect with ruthless theatre, letters read in the Senate, sudden reversals, swift arrests. Sejanus fell. Then the purge widened like a crack across ice. Anyone who had stood near him was swept away. Adults and children alike suffered, even when law and custom should have shielded the young. In one notorious case, the technicality that protected virgins from execution only multiplied the cruelty before death. As age advanced, his hungers may have dulled, but his fear grew larger than the island. He obsessed over omens and mortality, killed those who predicted endings, and then wandered briefly from Capri as if daring fate to find him. He travelled like a storm cloud. Towns tidied their streets, but hid their youth. The empire absorbed the cost of constant dread, while still collecting taxes, paving roads, and manning borders. It is one of the strangest lessons of his reign, how a vast system can keep functioning while something rotten sits at its heart. The ancient writers struggled to balance precision and revulsion. Tacitus, in particular, cool, careful, and skeptical, records with a restraint that makes his disgust more powerful. Bias exists, exaggeration is possible. But when so many voices, separated by time and politics, repeat the same contours, the island, the trials, the informers, the training of children, denial becomes a kind of wishful thinking. The weight of testimony presses toward a terrible conclusion. How did a man begin in competence and end in monstrosity? Some argue that power did what power does when it faces no counterweight. Others see a fragile mind, buckling under grief and drink and the isolation of rule. Perhaps his early self-discipline masked impulses waiting for an opportunity. Whatever the mix, labels don't solve the mystery. Clinical terms can map behaviors, but they can fully hold the reality of a person who used the state to feed private darkness. In Tiberius, we see the nightmare of concentrated power, a single will with no boundary, a system designed to serve one man's whims, and a culture too afraid to resist. Rome felt the pressure everywhere. Streets carried graffiti cursing him, scrawls made by hands that risked punishment to vent the only way they could. Families whispered caution into children's ears. Priests debated the anger of the gods as floods and fires struck. Sacred rituals no longer felt safe from profanation. Some cults retreated into secrecy. Others hardened their rules to keep the imperial household at a distance. The economy adapted in grim ways. Confiscations filled the treasury, while scaring wealth into hiding. The informers carved out a lucrative niche, profiting from accusations, cultivating targets, and riding waves of fear to fortune. The state's appetite became a market. Even the cost of Capri, the villas, the guards, the endless transport, drained resources while producing nothing but silence. Abroad, ambassadors found themselves waiting, sometimes for years, for audiences that might never come. Friendly kings measured every word, aware that their children in Rome were both honored guests and hostages. The Parthians watched, with a kind of wary fascination as their old rival turned its gaze inward, bleeding energy into suspicion. Governors on distant frontiers learned that survival in office required reading moods, not managing provinces. The empire's edges held, but more by inertia than inspiration. Arts shrank. Poets favored safe myths. Historians set their eyes on earlier centuries to avoid describing their own. Painters and sculptors took the bland road or fed the imperial taste directly. Architecture delivered marvels to Capri and chambers to Rome where screams could be contained. Where Augustus had knit the city together with public beauty, Tiberius spread his wealth in private halls and hidden rooms. Women suffered in unique ways. Beyond the countless victims, noble matrons were trapped in dilemmas no one should face. Refuse the emperor and risk annihilation. Comply and live with a grief that had no name. Mothers were forced to weigh their children's safety against their own survival. The old Roman honor accorded to matrons felt like theatre in a city that could not protect its daughters. Science and medicine bent to the court's demands. Physicians tended the emperor's body and learned the contours of his paranoia. Some concocted tonics and ointments. Others became reluctant participants in the machinery of torment, keeping prisoners alive for more questions, inspecting the young before the emperor's gaze. Those who refused paid a price. Those who complied carried the burden of what they had done. The legions, Rome's backbone, were not immune. Patronage had always mattered in promotions. Under Tiberius, a new set of favors took precedence. The praetorians, meant to guard the emperor, learned to terrorize the city. On the borders, soldiers still drilled and built roads. But the idea that Rome's sword served law and order rang hollow when that same sword enforced the perversions of a single man. Justice, Rome's proud export, became a mirror trick. The law remained, procedures were observed, phrases recited, but outcomes bent toward the emperor's desire. Advocates who argued too hard soon needed advocates themselves. Judges learned what verdicts pleased. The forms of legality masked a new reality: rule by fear with paperwork. As the years wore on, Tiberius nested layers of security around himself. Tasters for tasters, guards for guards, and stared into a future he feared and courted. He didn't trust conspiracies, he trusted omens. Yet in the end, omens didn't save him. They merely kept him company as he paced the halls of villas that looked out upon a sea more honest than the men around him. News travelled slowly, then all at once. Rome learned to read Capri's weather in the rhythm of couriers. A rush of sealed commands, then an eerie lull that meant someone was about to fall. Senators who woke to dawn birdsong went to bed, wondering if a line in an old speech could be twisted into treason. The city's pulse matched the emperor's moods, though most citizens never saw his face again. Power radiated invisibly. Letters, rumors, the sudden silence of a house where laughter had been heard the night before. What made this period so corrosive was the way ordinary incentives flipped. Under normal rule, virtue, competence, courage, honest speech has value. Under Tiberius, the safest bet was performance. A smile without opinion, an agreement without promise, an absence mistaken for loyalty. The people who thrived learned the grim craft of survival. They said much while meaning little. They noticed everything and revealed nothing. They congratulated colleagues in public and drafted contingency letters in private. Rome invented a new etiquette: how to be present without being seen. The treason trials became the stage for this etiquette. A senator raised a motion to honor the emperor for moderation. Another rose to expand the honor before Tiberius could object to modesty. When an accused man entered, the chamber tensed, and everyone rehearsed innocence by overdoing it. Too many nods, too many frowns at the right lines. The accused, if clever, tried to praise the emperor while denying the charge, speaking in loops that meant both "I didn't do this" and "if I did, you would be right to kill me." It rarely mattered. Condemnation had momentum. Property changed hands. Estates were catalogued. Slaves learned new names and new owners, and the city moved on. Beyond politics, the moral air thinned. Teachers told students that greatness required prudence. Parents told children that prudence meant silence. Friends learned to talk in codes. A story about an old general that mapped onto a current minister. A poem with a mythic king whose vices sounded familiar if you tilted your head. Writers filed their sharper lines away. Some wrote two versions of the same work, One for now, harmless, one for later, hidden. Libraries became dangerous places. A scroll could be a rope around the neck. On Capri, the emperor's world tightened further into ritual, suspicion, and appetite. Thrasyllus stayed close, tracking planets, measuring destinies in the sky as if fate had footnotes. The villas reflected a mind that couldn't rest. Courtyards at odd angles, hidden corridors, rooms placed for a view and a note of control. Water ran in channels that turned quiet courtyards into echo chambers, where a whisper sounded like a confession. There were patterns to his entertainments. He preferred novelty, a choreography of bodies and nerves. Yet the repetition of command felt like its own pleasure. He collected objects of provocation, carved fragments, painted scenes, delicate things from the East that, in another setting, would have sparked debate about aesthetics. Here they were props, lessons, flashcards for the next violation. Servants learned to adjust lamps to flatter skin and to mute defects. Musicians learned pieces that set a certain tempo, neither too slow to invite thought, nor too quick to allow panic to show. When it ended with a gesture, after which the logistics of disposal began. Someone always handled the after. The Spintriae moved through this world like shadows made flesh, called by name when needed, nameless when not. They were trained in obedience before technique, in reading a breath before hearing a command. Some were given tokens, bracelets, rings, promises of favor that meant safety only until the token failed to please. A few aged out and were paid off with silence and distance. Most vanished in a haze of rumor, the island swallowing them the way the sea swallows a drop. The procurement network branched across the empire. A procurer in Antioch knew the tastes for that season and wrote to a contact in Rhodes, who coordinated with a shipping captain who avoided certain ports. Governors courted favor by sending gifts along with reports. A noble in Gaul, eager for a step up, sent word that a relative's ward would make a charming addition to the court. Scribes kept lists that never entered the official archives. Every link in the chain told itself a story. Better me than someone crueler. Better I earn than starve. Better the child live in luxury than in poverty. Rationalizations piled up like cushions around a hard truth. Religious life faltered in public, deepened in private. Festivals were observed with polished discipline, but the warmth was gone. Some priests watched the emperor profane what they served and steeled themselves into a brittle silence. Others whispered that the gods were angry, that floods and fires were not mere accidents. Ordinary people improvised little rituals at home, a candle lit without explanation, a loaf left on a threshold. Rituals become truest when institutions fail. The small gestures made meaning in a city where official meaning had been emptied. Economically, the city hummed. Markets thrived. Ships unloaded grain at Ostia. Craftsmen argued about prices. Money moved. It has one of the hard facts of empires. They were big enough to keep going even when rotted at the center. Merchants learned to avoid any conspicuous wealth. Jewelers made pieces that could be melted down quickly. Patrons eyed clients as potential informers. The delatores carved their niche with expertise, cultivating gossip, planting provocations, then harvesting rewards. A house with too many lamps at a party might draw attention. A family with too many guests might be collecting allies. Even generosity became suspicious. Abroad, Rome's aura dimmed without collapsing. Ambassadors learned to bring gifts calibrated to the emperor's tastes without naming them. Allied rulers wrote letters 3 times, once bold, then softened again. The Parthians, constant chess partners in the East, were patient, watching for stumbles while setting their own pieces. On the frontiers, the legion's discipline sustained the line. A centurion in the Rhine didn't feel Capri directly. He felt supply lines, pay on time, and orders that made sense more often than not. Habit and tradition shielded the edges from the center's decay, at least for a while. Inside the city, a few women moved with extraordinary caution and narrow freedom. Antonia Minor, respected for her virtue and lineage, maintained a posture of immaculate restraint. No careless words, no visible alliances, no public dramatics. Survival for powerful women meant mastery over reaction. Others were not so fortunate. Wives of condemned men were swept into punishment. Daughters became leverage. The vocabulary of honor bent into tools of coercion. The old Roman reverence for matrons, custodians of family memory, couldn't withstand imperial appetite. Medicine bent in two directions, one toward the emperor, another toward everyone else. Court physicians became experts in managing symptoms rather than causes. Creams for sores, draughts for sleep, concoctions for desire. They experimented on the disposable, a moral injury that would follow their profession's memory. Meanwhile, ordinary doctors in the city kept treating fevers, setting bones, delivering babies. The world divides under tyranny. One medicine for power, one for people. The arts found covert roots. A poet wrote about a hunter pursuing a stag that always evaded capture. Readers knew the stag was power and the hunter was conscience. A sculptor made a mythic scene of a king who can't sleep, ringed with watchful figures. Those who understood could read the emperor in the marble. Public commissions were safe and bland. Gods with neutral expressions, victories with generic poses. In private, collectors hid riskier works behind false walls. After Sejanus fell, a vacuum opened, but not to freedom. Purges expanded, and the logic hardened. If you knew Sejanus, you were suspect. If you didn't, why not? The Senate tried to signal loyalty by overcompensating. More statues, more prayers, more oaths. The Praetorians learned a new lesson. Proximity to power was a hazard, but an opportunity too. Their prefects after Sejanus walked a tightrope, eyes fixed on Capri for signs of weather change. Education changed tone. Rhetoric teachers still drilled students on Cicero and Demosthenes, but the subtext was different. How to argue without arguing, how to praise without promising, how to ask a question that wasn't a challenge. The bravest teachers smuggled in Stoic lessons. Virtue for its own sake, inner freedom, the idea that you could hold your soul intact, even if your body was not your own. Some students listened and kept that ember for years. Among the people, humor survived in a sharper, meaner form. Jokes spread like contraband, puns on Capri that turned on double meanings, barbs that could be denied as misunderstandings. Laughter became a pressure valve and a test. Who laughed too quickly? Who didn't laugh at all? A good joke was currency and a liability. Even humor had to learn the art of self-preservation. The emperor's body continued its decline. He grew more theatrical about hygiene, more impatient with discomfort, more temperamental when treatments failed. He rotated favorites and servants as if freshness itself could ward off decay. The villas that once felt like fortresses began to feel like cages, each guard a reminder of the fear that had built them. He counted his protections. He counted his enemies. He reread Thrasyllus's charts. Confidence never came. Sometimes he sent sudden gifts. Gold to a city struck by fire, grain in a lean season, a public gesture of benevolence that arrived like sunlight through cloud. Cynics said it was calculation. Others grasped at hope. The contradiction defined him, an emperor capable of measured policy and charitable impulse, who also engineered a system of terror and exploitation. People tried to reconcile the halves and failed, then learned to live with the paradox as if it were normal. The law's degradation produced lasting scars. Precedents set in panic calcified into practice. Judges learned that process could be intact while justice evaporated. The rhetoric of majesty stretched to cover any insult, and once stretched, it didn't snap back. Future rulers would find these tools ready to hand. Informers with networks, statutes with elastic meanings, courts trained to nod. It's easier to inherit a machine than dismantle it. For many Romans, faith in the city's destiny dimmed, but didn't die. The empire still felt like a fact of nature. Roads, aqueducts, markets, laws, things that outlast any man. Yet the memory of Capri seeped into the foundation. Parents told sons and daughters, remember that power can rot, remember that law can lie, remember that crowds can cheer a monster because they're afraid. Memory is its own kind of institution. It doesn't govern, but it can warn. At times, the emperor seemed to hear a murmur of judgment under the flattery. He'd lash out, then retreat, then test loyalty with feints, announce a policy and reverse it, watch who adapted fastest, who grumbled, who froze. It wasn't strategy so much as reflex. He had trained himself to see threat everywhere, and having done so, found it. That validation kept the cycle turning. In private, a few brave souls confronted choices that would define them. A governor receiving a request for a child. A father deciding whether to accept an invitation to Capri. A mother hiding a daughter in a relative's country villa. Not every story ended in tragedy. Some ended in cleverness and flight. But too many ended in compliance dressed as prudence. Those choices, multiplied across years, made the system run. Meanwhile, in Rome's poorer quarters, the empire's terror felt distant until it didn't. A neighbor vanished because he said the wrong thing in the wrong tavern. A family was suddenly rich, then suddenly gone. A street performer mocked a myth too closely and disappeared from his usual corner. People learned to notice patterns. The absence of a certain official, the presence of certain guards, the rumor of a ship leaving for the south with no cargo listed. The ordinary city, with its bakers, mule drivers, and fishmongers, learned to live near a volcano and call the tremors weather. As years pressed on, Tiberius's brief returns to the mainland had the feel of hauntings. He appeared, and a great quiet fell over the route. His cortege glided through streets that had been scrubbed to sterile brightness. Windows shuttered, doors half open with faces peeking. He looked out from a litter, pale, painted, unreadable. Gifts were presented, oaths renewed, and then the storm passed back to sea. Ancient authors, writing later, tried to make sense of a reign that produced such dissonance, efficiency and atrocity, order and obscenity. Some leaned into sensation, others, more cautious, still couldn't look away from Capri. The repetition in their accounts, the same motifs, the same machinery of fear, gives them weight beyond gossip. If even the sober writers whisper the same dark chorus, it's because the city they loved was haunted by the same song. The most disturbing legacy during the reign wasn't a building or a law, it was a skill set. People learned to survive by small betrayals. They practiced the art of not knowing. They curated their faces. They docked their laughter. They trimmed their words. Those habits would outlive the emperor. A culture teaches itself how to be brave. It also teaches itself how to be afraid. And all the while, Capri stood in the sun, cliffs flaring gold at dusk, blue water laying a mirror at their feet. Beauty sat beside horror, as it often does, making the horror both sharper and less believable. Visitors today stand where guards once stood and see only the gleam. The wind erases screams faster than history can hold them. But the stories remain, carried by pages that refuse to forget what the waves forgot. By the early 30s AD, the empire felt trapped inside a paradox. The machinery of Rome worked, but the people who ran it were cracking. Governors filed reports, taxes arrived, legions drilled. Yet conversation, the lifeblood of Roman public life, had thinned to a careful drizzle. The word maestas hovered over everything like incense you couldn't wash from your clothes. Men of letters learned to write with a bent quill, crooked enough to slip past suspicion, sharp enough to keep their own souls from dulling. After Sejanus's fall, terror grew granular. It didn't just strike famous houses. It seeped into middling families, clients, freedmen, even the servants who overheard too much. Informers diversified. Some specialized in literature, hunting for lines that could be read tendentiously. Others tracked household staff, collecting kitchen chatter and bedroom complaints. A few focused on religious practices, who visited which temple, who consulted which seer. Each informer cultivated patrons in the Senate or the Praetorian Guard, selling curated outrage like fine wares. The Senate, keen to prove loyalty, devised honors that bordered on satire. They voted thanksgivings for the emperor's clemency after purges, erected statues to his mildness while sending more names to the executioner. Every vote was a test of calibration. Too little praise smelled like critique. Too much praise looked like mockery. The best speakers learned to write sentences that could be heard two ways and applauded either way. Rome had invented the double-bind. Now it perfected double-speak. Tiberius, observing from Capri, treated politics like a bloodless hunt. He tested, watched reactions ripple, then struck. Thrasyllus charted auspicious days not only for decisions, but for letters to be opened in the Senate. Timing became a weapon. An accusation arriving on a festival forced pious men to choose between religious decorum and imperial commands. Many chose both, perform the rite, then sign the death warrant. His private cruelties escalated in complexity, even as his body failed him. The villas became laboratories of control. Sightlines were engineered, sounds were channeled, doors opened silently, floors were cool and unyielding. The staff moved on invisible cues. One touch of a bronze bell, one flick of a curtain. Objects around him, cups, small figurines, a stylus, doubled as signals. To outsiders, the spaces looked like serenity. To insiders, they were clocks with too many hands. The Spintree's training grew more systematized. New arrivals were taught by older children who had learned to mask fear behind calm. Tutors drilled posture, breathing, compliance to nuance. How to anticipate without appearing to anticipate. How to be present without being human. They were given stories about destiny, told that service to the emperor was a path beyond their birth, that luxury was proof of favor, that silence was virtue. Indoctrination filled the gaps where family had been. When rewards came, they were precise. A silk garment, a day without appointment, a meal at a better table. The illusion of choice. From time to time, a child escaped. The stories of flight were always sparse. Someone looked away. A storm delayed a ship. A fisherman hid a small body under nets. Those who made it back to the mainland rarely spoke. Trauma sealed lips better than any oath, but their existence fed the city's rumor mill. The island was not impregnable. Fate could be bent. Sometimes the sea gave back what Capri had claimed. Not every horror came from Capri. In Rome, punishments took on a ceremonial chill. Executions were carried out with a strange formality, as if obeying an aesthetic. Parents summoned to watch were given seats. Guards handled the proceedings with rehearsed indifference. Now and then, a reprieve arrived at the last moment, prompting a public weeping that doubled the bond of fear. Mercy, weaponized, leaves a deeper mark than cruelty alone. Religion became a contested language. Official rites praised the emperor's piety. Private altars pleaded for protection from it. Augurs read birds with extra care, aware that an unlucky omen could be construed as sabotage. The Vestals kept their ritual flame with a new intensity, as if constancy could counter chaos. Philosophers whispered stoic maxims in safe rooms. The only true freedom is within. The only true power is mastery of self. These didn't topple tyrants, but they helped people endure one. In the provinces, the supply lines of vice became part of the administrative map. A courier riding from Asia Minor might carry 2 packets, one with land assessments and harvest yields, another with names written in a careful hand. Local elites learned the angle. Send tribute, but also send tribute. Moral rot became a protocol. Talk to any seasoned official, and you'd hear the same rhythm. We maintain the roads. We maintain the peace. We maintain the fiction. Despite everything, Tiberius sometimes showed the old competence. He stabilized finances with disciplined spending. He resisted costly wars. In a famine, he opened the granaries and cut taxes. These actions complicated the city's hatred. People prefer monsters to be simple. Mixed signals make judgment feel unstable. And that instability is itself a form of control. If cruelty can be offset by prudence, some begin to call it complexity. Complexity then becomes an alibi. Art mirrored the split. Public sculpture idealized the emperor with traditional virtues, pietas, gravitas, while private commissions indulged in themes of entrapment, Danae behind bars of gold, Europa borne away against her will, Orpheus turning and losing what he loved. The metaphors were not subtle, but they were deniable. Music at dinners softened into modes that avoided exuberance. Too much joy sounded suspicious. Education tightened the mask further. Grammar masters punished not just errors of syntax, but errors of judgment. A student choosing the wrong historical example for a rhetorical exercise could be corrected with a look that meant, "Do you want to live?" A few teachers, braver than most, told their pupils that history was a mirror and a warning. They used old names to teach new dangers. A clever boy could read between eras and draw the right conclusions without saying them aloud. The law's expansion under Maestas reached absurdities that revealed its true purpose. A man was charged for letting a coin with the emperor's face touch a latrine floor, another for an offhand line at a dinner party repeated by a servant angling for a reward. Judges cited precedent with straight faces. The proceedings had the feel of a theatre where everyone knew the plot and pretended not to. The pretense kept the gears greased. If you pretend well enough, you eventually forget you're pretending. In 31 AD's aftermath, the purges took on a bureaucratic sheen. Inventories were immaculate. Seals were applied with ceremony. Witnesses signed neat lists. The state grew better at dispossessing people than protecting them. A child could map the process: accusation, arrest, inventory, auction. Auctions became social events. One more place to display taste while securing bargains from the ruins of a life. Citizens who would never lift a sword to kill could lift a paddle to bid. Capri's architecture continued to evolve, each new addition an accessory to vigilance, towers with views in every direction, pathways designed to be confusing to anyone new. Rooms arranged so the emperor could appear by surprise. He found a measure of joy in outwitting space. Paranoia likes puzzles. It needs them to feel smart. But every solved puzzle births a new unsolved one. Anxiety is a hydra. The emperor's reliance on omens turned him into a choreographer of coincidence. He would delay a decision because Mercury was ill-placed, then interpret the delay's consequence as confirmation. He rewarded astrologers who reinforced his patterns and dismissed those who suggested he could choose differently. Freedom scares men who fear themselves. Astrology gave him a story where destiny, not choice, wrote the script. Sometimes, in the still hours, the island sounded like a monastery. Soft steps, murmured instructions, wind in the cypresses, water shifting in basins. Serenity was the aesthetic. Control was the function. A visiting senator might leave thinking he had toured a retreat designed for contemplation. He had, if contemplation is the art of subtracting every discomfort at every other person's expense. The Praetorian Guard's culture hardened into cynicism. Veterans taught recruits the etiquette of terror. Keep your face still. Do not look at the family. Count the steps from door to cart. Say, by order, and nothing else. Off duty, they drank, laughed too loud, and spent their wages on distractions measured in hours. A few went home and listened to children's bedtime stories with heads bowed, as if cleansing could be found in small rooms. Among the populace, a new folklore bloomed. Parents told cautionary tales involving Capri's cliffs. Street plays hinted at tyrant kings punished by gods in creative ways. People need to believe in cosmic balances. When the world shows none, they invent them in art. It's a rehearsal for justice, if not its arrival. Rome's built environment reflected competing eras. The monuments of Augustus stood like monuments of hope. Tiberius added little public to match them, preferring his island palaces. The contrast was visual philosophy. One ruler knit the city to itself, the next withdrew and built for himself. The message soaked in. Citizens love the places that love them back. Sometime in the mid-30s, the Emperor S visits to the mainland had the brittle air of someone testing whether the world still feared him. It did. Towns staged welcomes with an intensity that betrayed terror. The poor cheered because they had been told that cheering was cheap insurance. The rich cheered because not cheering was expensive. As the cortege moved on, you could feel the city exhale. Historians later would argue degree and detail. Did this or that atrocity occur exactly as told? Were numbers inflated? Bias is real. So is fear's memory. Trauma exaggerates and clarifies at once. Yet across the sources a pattern holds. The sexual predation of the vulnerable, the bureaucratization of terror, the weaponization of law, the isolation of the ruler, the complicity of the ruling class. These are not embellishments. They are structure. What then kept resistance from congealing? Fear, obviously, but also fragmentation. Each person faced a private cliff, a case, a choice, a night. Evil thrives when it can isolate decisions, turning collective outrage into individual concessions. Add to this Rome's cultural tolerance for certain brutalities, slavery, exposure of infants, the arena, and you get a society pre-adapted to look away from suffering when it's dressed in ritual or law. Amid this, a quiet countercurrent persisted. A philosopher wrote a small handbook on how to keep your mind free. A matron sheltered a neighbor's child and told no one, not even her husband. A minor official misfiled a name and saved a life by accident that wasn't. A captain looked the other way at a harbor. Not revolution, not even rebellion, just stitches, tiny and human, against a tear too big to mend. By late 36 AD, the emperor was an old man with a young man's insomnia. He counted protections in the dark, guards, charms, prophecies. He could not count the enemies he imagined. Thrasyllus still charted the stars, but his comfort was diminishing returns. The island had given Tiberius everything he demanded and nothing he needed. The sea kept reflecting a truth he refused. No guard can arrest time. Reports reached Rome that he was failing, then rebounded with news that he had rallied. The city learned a new tension, the hope of change braided with the dread of who might follow. When a state's sanity depends on the character of one person, every rumor becomes a national mood. Households rehearse two kinds of celebration and two kinds of caution, waiting to see which to unwrap. In those last months, letters from Capri grew shorter, sharper. A few showed flashes of the old administrative clarity, orders about grain shipments, discipline in the camps, appointments with merit. Then came others, petty, cruel, meticulously destructive. The split had always been there. Age made it starker, like a scar that thickens as skin thins. On a March morning in 37 AD, the news came that the emperor was dead. Then came the counter-rumor. No, he had revived. Then finally, confirmation. The city didn't wait for the formalities to decide how it felt. Relief rippled first, then louder currents broke surface. People shouted what they had rehearsed in their hearts for years. Some demanded his body be denied the honors of an emperor, thrown into the Tiber like a criminal. Others cautioned patience. Fear outlives its object by habit. The Senate met in a chamber that felt bigger without his shadow. They spoke of honors withheld, of curses deserved, of how to cleanse a city without cleansing its memory. Even in freedom, calculation remained. They knew that the next ruler would be watching the tone, measuring how a world awakes from a long nightmare. They hoped for a morning and feared for another night. Celebration is a fragile thing after long fear. Rome tried it anyway. Crowds spilled into streets, laughing too loudly, weeping without warning, testing whether sound itself was safe again. Vendors pushed out trays of honey cakes as if sugar could sweeten memory. In the theatres, applause came early and often, more for the relief of clapping than the performance. People shouted to the Tiber with Tiberius, a chant that was both curse and exorcism. Public joy can feel like a cleansing, but it rarely cleans completely. The Senate, tasting space for the first time in years, moved quickly but carefully. They debated honors, or rather, the withholding of honors. Deification? No. A funeral befitting an emperor? Reluctantly, yes, if only to avoid setting precedents that might later be used against good rulers. Caligula, the heir apparent, pressed for proper rights. He understood the theatre of transition. Denying Tiberius certain formalities risked inflaming factions or diminishing the office he was about to inherit. So Rome staged the official goodbye, while the people staged another in their hearts. What to do with the laws and habits that had warped under the old regime became the urgent question. Some senators proposed pruning back maiestas, narrowing its scope, retiring the most absurd precedents, disbanding a few of the darker tribunals. Others, sensing how useful those tools could be, urged moderation in reform. The danger of tyrannical machinery is not only in its use by monsters, but in the temptation it offers to the merely mediocre. Once built, it whispers, "I can help you too." The informers sensed the weather turning and changed clothes accordingly. A few vanished, taking their profits to distant estates along quiet coasts. Others performed public penitence, donating to temples, sponsoring games, announcing a newfound reverence for mercy. Those who had cultivated Caligula hurried to repaint themselves as loyal servants of the new dawn. Rome is talented at metamorphosis. Survival here is an art form. Meanwhile, Capri's villas stood like stage sets suddenly, without an actor. The sea went on shining. Servants dismantled routines that had governed their lives for a decade. Lists appeared, inventories of furniture, tapestries, statues. Some of the most incriminating items were quietly destroyed by those who knew discretion could still save them. Archaeology later would find luxury where rumors insist on horror. But absence of certain kinds of evidence says more about the efficiency of erasure than the purity of the past. The Praetorian Guard, pivot point of imperial fate, recalibrated. Macro, the new prefect, had his own ambitions and his own story about the emperor's final moments, stories that conveniently placed him as essential. The guard learned yet another etiquette: how to be feared without saying why, how to flatter a successor by erasing a predecessor, how to look forward with weapons polished by the past. Stability is their brand. Leverage is their business. Among the people, grief surfaced in unexpected places. Not grief for Tiberius, grief for wasted years, for silenced voices, for children who did not come home. A city can mourn its own losses while refusing to mourn the man who caused them. Shrines to household gods saw more offerings that week than they had in years. Whispers of thanks, quiet, careful, rose in kitchens, markets, courtyards. The divine got credit for an event that politics had delivered. People need stories that make sense. Heaven offers better plots than committees. Writers loosened their hands. The first impulse was satire, the second was caution. A few penned lines that danced along the edge, grateful to be dancing at all. Others began gathering notes and testimonies. What had happened in whose house, who had fallen when, how the letters from Capri had landed. The historiography of terror begins the moment fear lifts enough to name it. But even then, people write with an eye on the next ruler's temper. Debate about Tiberius's nature flared immediately. Revisionists argued for nuance. He had governed well in finances, kept peace, avoided foreign disasters. Traditionalists countered, such competence makes his moral wreckage worse, not better. A man who could manage the empire's bookkeeping while demolishing its soul deserves not complexity, but condemnation. The city discovered that moral arithmetic does not add neatly. Two prudent policies don't cancel one atrocity. The question of causes seized imaginations. Was he born twisted and merely found opportunity? Did grief and isolation bend him beyond repair? Did the architecture of power itself, its insulation, incentives, adulation, warp an otherwise ordinary man? Stoics emphasized the inner citadel. Character is fate, and he chose his. Others pointed to the system. Give any person absolute impunity, and you will incubate evil. The argument mattered because it doubled as diagnosis. If the monster was solely a monster, all you had to do was avoid monsters. If the system could make monsters, reform had to go deeper. Caligula, in his first months, performed a careful counter-Tiberius. He sought the crowds, gave them games, rescinded some trials, returned a few exiled families, opened the vaults for generosity. His face in public became a tonic for people who had grown used to an absent emperor. The city, traumatized, responded with relief that bordered on worship. Hope, starved, overeats at the first meal. Those early days felt like proof that the wound could heal. Later events would darken that hope, but for the moment, Rome tried believing. For families scarred by Capri, the island became unspeakable. Few wanted to name it. Fewer wanted to visit. Some households passed down rules that sounded like superstitions. Avoid certain songs, certain colors, certain dates. Trauma writes rituals. A matron in Trastevere lit a lamp every night at the same hour and left bread on the windowsill. She told her granddaughter it was for the lost. The child didn't ask lost who. You don't always need specifics to be faithful. Economically, the unfreezing began. Merchants took money out of hiding. Patrons restarted stalled projects. Architects drew plans for public works they had delayed. The city breathed investment the way lungs breathe air. Yet caution remained. People understood that the tools of terror still existed, and that a kind smile today could become a hard stare tomorrow. Rome's experience with swings taught it to enjoy harvest while preparing for frost. The legal scholars, cautious creatures, began writing opinions that nudged the law back towards sanity. They narrowed definitions, insisted on corroboration, frowned upon anonymous accusations. Nothing revolutionary, just the slow work of tightening a system's bolts so the machine thrummed less like a weapon. Courts began to ask questions again, rather than merely count votes toward a foregone conclusion. In the glow of change, even modest due process felt like sunlight. In private salons, philosophers found receptive ears. They spoke about limits on power, about the dignity of the person, about duties that trump convenience. Stoics, especially, offered a framework that sounded like a cure. Cultivate virtue independent of circumstance. Refuse complicity even when it costs. See suffering as a test of integrity. These ideas had moved quietly under Tiberius. Now they moved with measured boldness. Some would pay later for that boldness. Ideas often do. The cultural memory of Tiberius began to solidify into motif. Playwrights crafted villains who smiled with thin lips, counted their guards twice, and loved audiences of one. Poets turned the island into a symbol. Beauty masking rot, cliffs hiding crimes, the sea as witness and accomplice. Artists painted storms that never touched shore, lightning that struck the same place again and again. Metaphor is a city's way of filing evidence in the gallery of the mind. Across the empire, allied kings adjusted their posture. The court at Rome, while chastened, still held all the cards that mattered: legions, coin, prestige. Yet reports of Capri had travelled with merchants and diplomats. Some foreign rulers used the comparison to flatter themselves. Our court is strict but clean. Their court, learned and rich, hid a pit. Others worried that proximity to Rome's favour could be a moral hazard. The empire's soft power, its claim to civilize, had been eroded by the stories parents told their children about the emperor across the sea. In households high and low, people revisited their own choices. A senator who had voted for an innocent man's death stared at the floor longer than usual when his grandson asked about virtue. A procurer counted coins that suddenly weighed more than metal. A guard avoided the mirror. Some found ways to atone: gifts to widows, quiet support for orphaned children, sponsorship of schools. Others doubled down on denial, the easiest balm of all. Self-judgment is a trial without appeal. Some commute their own sentences, some don't. The physical legacy of the reign complicated memory. Capri's engineering amazed even those who loathed what it had hosted. Terraces clinging to rock, waterworks that whispered through courtyards, sightlines that made the sky feel curated. Roman genius had formed a paradise. Roman power had corrupted it. This duality rankled and taught. You can build marvels and still lose your soul. You can admire the arch and condemn the architect's purpose. Rome, proud of its making, had to learn the humility of misused mastery. Medical writers began to speculate, a habit as old as curiosity. They asked whether certain ailments of the body lead to ailments of the mind. They wondered about poisons you cannot see, metals in water, varnishes in cosmetics, the slow drip of substances through years. Some suggested that chronic drinking decays not just flesh, but restraint. Others argued that blaming substances is a way to soften the verdict on will. Whatever their theories, they couldn't write prescriptions for the dead or vaccines for power. The value of their speculation lay in warning. What we ingest shapes what we become. The military, steady as ever, held the frontiers without drama. Commanders wrote reports that read like an anchor to a drifting city, patrol intervals, stockpiles, fort repairs. Inside the ranks, old virtues kept showing up. Discipline, camaraderie, a code of honor that looked naive in the capital and noble at the Rhine. Soldiers measure leaders by pay, rations, and purpose. Tiberius had delivered the first two. The last grew cloudy. With his passing, clarity did not immediately return, but neither did it matter for daily drill. Empires endure in part because soldiers keep marching while politicians debate metaphysics. For jurists and teachers, Tiberius became a case study. Law lectures used his reign to illustrate the danger of elastic statutes. Rhetoric classes used his letters to show how phrasing can hide intent. Philosophy seminars used his life to argue that the greatest victory is over oneself. Education, long distorted by fear, began again to aim at citizens rather than survivors. Even so, the techniques of survival remained in the culture, hard to unlearn, useful in any future storm. A question lingered in every forum. How do you prevent the next one? Structural answers circulated: strengthen the Senate, empower law, limit the guard, formalize succession to reduce paranoia. Cultural answers surfaced too: honor truth-tellers, distrust flattery, teach children to value courage more than comfort. The difficulty was obvious. Structures bend to culture, and culture bends to fear. Prevention is not a law you pass. It's a habit you build. Meanwhile, in the quieter quarters, lives resumed. Bakers woke before dawn, hands in flour, measuring salt the way their fathers had. Fishmongers slapped the day's catch onto wetboards. Schoolboys recited lines. A midwife hurried across a courtyard at night with a lamp, focused on the work of beginnings. The normality that tyranny cannot fully kill rose to the surface again. This too is Rome's strength. It refuses to stop being itself. As for Tiberius's body, it received rites, not love. Processions moved with practiced solemnity. Official mourners keened. Priests intoned prayers. The city watched with a mixture of relief and revulsion, like attending the funeral of a plague. Caligula's presence and insistence on decorum were political necessities and early signs of a style that would later show its own shadows. The crowd's chant, "Never again," was both promise and plea. Historians, when they finally found their voices fully, would give Tiberius the kind of afterlife he dreaded, a memory that doesn't die. They would argue details for centuries, but on the essentials they would agree. An emperor who combined administrative competence with personal depravity. A regime that made perversion a public function. A legal system twisted into a blade. A culture taught to survive by silence. His name would become shorthand, a warning label stuck onto power itself. And yet, even here, the story is not only about one man. It's about the architecture that held him, the courtiers who fed him, the laws that armed him, the citizens who adapted to him, and the few who resisted him in ways small and large. Blame is not a pie with finite slices. You can give most to the emperor and still have enough to go around. The lesson sits uncomfortably in the Roman chest. We built the stage on which he performed, Night fell on Rome more softly after his death. There were still arrests, still whispers, still the old habits of caution. But windows opened a little wider, voices rose a little freer, songs lingered in courtyards a little longer. The city, after all it had seen, remained itself, bruised, wiser, and stubbornly alive. And on Capri, the wind moved through empty rooms, rearranging dust where once orders had been spoken, carrying out to sea a silence that felt, at last, like an ending. Time smooths the edges of terror, but it doesn't erase them. In the years after Tiberius, Rome learned to carry two truths at once: that the empire could function brilliantly, and that it could also go morally blind. That one man's appetites could warp a civilization, and that millions of ordinary acts could sustain it anyway. People adapted because people always do, some in ways that preserved dignity, others in ways that traded it for safety. The city held both kinds in its forums and alleyways, its libraries and barracks. Capri, left behind like a stage after the play, became an emblem. Sailors rounding its cliffs pointed out the terraces and told stories in lowered voices. Guides invented legends, some embroidered, some almost plain. Lovers walked its paths and felt the strange friction between the beauty before their eyes and the ugliness their minds could not quite imagine. Even nature seemed complicit, a sea that glittered, a sky that pretended to be innocent. The island taught a lesson that Rome would not forget. Evil doesn't always live in darkness. Sometimes it rents the brightest view. In classrooms, Tiberius entered the curriculum as both caution and mirror. Law students studied the scope of maestas as an example of how statutes bloat when fear feeds them. Reiters dissected imperial correspondence to show how language can be a velvet glove over a clenched fist. Philosophers spoke about the corrupting force of unchecked power and the duty to resist quietly when loudly is impossible. The idea was not to dwell morbidly, but to inoculate, teach the symptoms so future generations could spot the sickness early. The economy, robust as a river, kept rolling. Trade routes pulsed with grain, oil, wine, textiles. Ports bustled. Markets resumed their music of haggling and laughter. Yet underneath, the old adaptations persisted. Wealth moved more discreetly. Families diversified assets into things that could be hidden or liquidated quickly. Merchants learned that a modest facade might be the wiser billboard. Prosperity returned, but it dressed humbler, as if an overbright sheen might summon storms. In literature and art, memory matured into form. Epic poets wove tyrants into subplots, their evils couched in myth but familiar in detail. Historians carved morality from chronology, letting structure condemn what their tongues no longer feared to name. Painters filled villas with scenes that balanced warning and wish. A hero standing firm against a king, a goddess punishing an impious lord. Audiences learned to read those images like a second language, the grammar of conscience. Within households, the aftershocks continued. A father who had once chosen silence over protest now urged his son to cultivate courage, even if only inside his own skull. A mother taught her daughter how to recognize the first steps toward complicity. The small lie, the comfortable blind spot, the promoted friend you cannot quite respect. Family law accumulated cautionary tales, reminders that survival without principle is an expensive bargain. These weren't speeches, they were habits, nudges, the subtle shaping of character across years. The Praetorian Guard remained what it had become, a pivot of fate. Prefects came and went, oaths were sworn with polished helmets. Corridors near the palace stayed noisy with footsteps. The Guard took lessons from every reign. Be indispensable, not dominant. Keep your sword sharp and your profile low. Align with the winning narrative early. Their presence reminded Rome that reforming an institution is slower than naming its flaws. Out in the provinces, Rome's image healed more slowly. Governors held court with a calibrated strictness, eager to demonstrate that justice could be stern without being sadistic. Local elites, who had once seen imperial favor as pure sugar, now tasted the bitterness that could come with it. Diplomatic letters leaned into themes of order, law, predictability, as if repetition could rebuild trust. The empire had learned that hard power conquers, soft power governs. Capri had corroded the latter. It would take decades to restore. Philosophically, Rome wrestled with a problem that has no simple answer. If power magnifies character, then how do you ensure good character rules? You can't legislate virtue into a soul. You can, however, design systems that make vice more expensive. Voices argued for balances, reviving the Senate's spine, fixing clearer procedures for trials, requiring public votes where secrets had once festered. The more sober minds knew that structure is a fence, not a cure. Fences help. They do not guarantee. The grim niche, carved by informers, didn't vanish, but it shrank. Public scorn made the profession less glamorous. Legal reforms made it less profitable. Some delatores tried to rebrand themselves as guardians of the state, an early form of public relations. A few ended the way they had enriched themselves, accused by rivals, stripped of wealth, punished under laws they had exploited. Justice rarely balances precisely. Sometimes it wobbles in the right direction. For the victims who survived, memory remained raw. Many had no words for what they'd seen. Roman vocabulary had limits politely observed in public. Their pain lived outside those limits. A handful spoke in circles to trusted ears. Others chose silence as a kind of sanctuary. The city offered few outlets, no tribunals for truth, no monuments for the lost. Rome celebrated victories. It did not memorialize wounds. So remembrance took private forms. A name whispered before sleep. A piece of jewelry worn always, a meal set for someone who would never come. Archaeology, centuries later, would unearth flaws of geometric elegance, fountains' channels, domed ceilings that played with light. Scholars would argue what absence meant. Were the darkest rooms cleared, or were the darkest stories exaggerated? The debate would run along the same old groove: skeptics versus believers, evidence versus testimony. But even as spades found no chains in a garden, the texts found chains in memory. Not every crime leaves a shard. Sometimes the only artifact is a sentence written by a trembling hand. The comparison game, irresistible to historians, placed Tiberius beside other infamous rulers. Nero's flamboyance, Caligula's spectacle, Domitian's cold suspicion, each had a signature. Tiberius's signature was the fusion, the bureaucratic harnessing of private depravity. Others staged their vices. He engineered his. The state didn't just tolerate his darkness. It became its instrument. That is why his name stuck, why it felt like a brand burned into the era's skin. As for causes, the argument that began at his death never stopped. Nature versus nurture, sorrow versus sickness, wine versus will, lead pipes versus lonely nights. None of these explanations absolved. They only apportioned. A more bracing conclusion emerged. The conditions that make a Tiberius are reproducible. Concentrate power, reward flattery, punish honesty, wrap vice in ceremony, and you will grow what you fear. The antidotes are equally reproducible. Limits, transparency, courage, the celebration of those who tell you what you don't want to hear. In civic spaces, rituals evolved to honor that lesson. Festivals quietly elevated virtues that had been punished. Frank speech, faithful friendship, mercy. Orators praised past citizens who had risked themselves for others. Statues went up to honor not just conquerors but guardians of law. The city used marble to train memory toward better reflexes. And then there were the small lives, always the most telling index. A baker hired an apprentice whose parents had disappeared in a purge. Years later, that apprentice owned a shop and hired another orphan. A schoolteacher who had burned a manuscript in terror rewrote it from memory for his students, adding a section on conscience. A midwife whose daughter had vanished stood at windows in the early evening and looked west, where the light over the sea fades last. She never said Capri. She didn't need to. From time to time, Roman jurists cited Tiberius as a negative example in legal opinions. Let us not fall into the excess of former days, one wrote, a careful way of saying, we remember. The best traditions of Roman law, reasoned argument, respect for procedure, clarity about offences, reasserted themselves like grass through cracked stone. Not a revolution, but a restoration, and restorations, though quieter, often last longer. In the museums of mind and stone, Tiberius sat uneasily. Busts showed a stern countenance, the marble cool, the eyes drilled to catch light. Plaques recounted campaigns, decrees, renovations, the administrative ledger of a capable ruler. Meanwhile, in books and whispers, another portrait persisted. The man on Capri, the letters that killed, the children uncounted by census or cenotaph. Rome learned to hold both images side by side, a cognitive dissonance it earned by surviving him. The final words about him were never final. Each generation rediscovered the story and read it against its own fears. A city under censorship saw Capri as prophecy. A city reveling in freedom saw it as a warning not to grow complacent. A scholar traced the evolution of the charge of maestas from legal tool to legal tumor. A poet retold the myth of a king who mistook the sea's horizon for the world and built palaces on cliffs to avoid looking inward. Every retelling kept the embers warm. This, in the end, is the most useful legacy, useful precisely because it is heavy. Tiberius forces Rome and anyone listening to confront the fragility of civilization. The aqueduct, the road, the law, the poem. These are achievements, yes, but they are also veneers that can crack if the hand that holds them squeezes too hard. The answer is not despair. The answer is vigilance born of memory, courage built as habit, institutions designed with the humility that comes from knowing what humans are capable of on both ends of the spectrum. And so the scene returns, as scenes do, to Capri at dusk. The cliffs glow. The water folds itself into the color of metal and wine. Wind moves through pines. Somewhere in that air hangs the echo of commands, the rustle of silks, the quiet steps of those who learn to anticipate a whim. The villas are stone and shadow now. The sea makes its old sound at the base of the rock. Beauty remains, indifferent but enduring. In Rome, night gathers along the Tiber, and lanterns bloom on bridges. A father tells a child a story not of monsters, but of choices. The guard who looked away, the senator who refused, the woman who hid a stranger's baby, the man who used the law like a shield rather than a sword. The child listens, eyes wide, and asks if such courage matters. The father says it always has, and always will, though it rarely feels like enough in the moment. History does not end with villains or heroes. It ends, each day, with people deciding what to do next. Tiberius is gone, but the pattern he revealed persists wherever power gathers and fear multiplies. Rome's answer, then and now, is imperfect but essential. Remember, restrain, rebuild, and teach. Build systems that make it easier to be good and harder to be terrible. Honor the quiet braveries. Refuse the easy lie. Tell the hard story. The empire outlived him by centuries. Its roads still run under modern feet. Its words still thread through our laws. But the most important inheritance is a warning signed with his name. Power without conscience creates monsters. Culture without courage births accomplices. Beauty without memory invites repetition. If Rome learned that and taught it forward, then even the darkest reigns can yield a sliver of light, the wisdom to keep watch by,